Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Parrot Analytics Live. My name is Samuel, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Parrot Analytics. To get started, I would like to extend a special welcome to all of our Demand 360 enterprise customers. Thank you all for making the time to be with us here today, especially those that are connecting from various time zones around the globe. We appreciate it. As we wait for the room to fill, please feel free to write in the chat where you're joining from. I think it would once again be really super interesting to see all the countries represented here with us today. Just remember, by default, chat is set to hosts and panelists. So have a quick look at that setting and make sure you set this to everyone before you send your message. Our topic today is an interactive walkthrough of our latest global demand report presented by our Industry Insights Manager, Christopher Hamilton. We are in for a real treat. Chris always has many interesting insights and observations to share, and I can't wait to get into today's webinar. Hello, Sao Paulo, UK, Las Vegas, Mexico, Toronto, Los Angeles. Welcome, welcome everyone. Just a couple of admin things before we get started. We've received all your questions that you have already submitted. Thank you. We will address these at the end of the webinar, and I'll moderate our session today. So you can submit your questions throughout the webinar in the chat. If you like, you can once again select everyone when you submit your question, as sometimes we get the same question asked twice. And once we're done with the presentation, we'll answer as many of your questions as we can at the end of our session today. And hello, Boston, Mexico City, Pittsburgh, Tinseltown. Everyone's here. This is fantastic. Miami, welcome, welcome, welcome. And now I'd like to hand over to you, Chris. Take it away.
Awesome. Thanks for the intro, Samuel. And thanks everyone for tuning up today. It's always a treat for me to get to share our latest report and a few of my favorite insights. And I also want to make sure to thank everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. A lot of them were actually really relevant, so I've addressed a few of them in the presentation. But just remember, if you have any questions as I'm presenting, put them in the chat and we can hopefully get to them at the end. Just a reminder of what we're covering today. So our quarterly global demand report looks at top-line global demand trends in Q2. It has a deep dive on the state of US streaming, and it specifically looks into demand trends for shows in 10 markets around the world. And we're going to be going through some of the highlights in the report today, but I've also included a few additional trends that aren't actually in the report, but I think supplement it really nicely. Great, so to kick things off, I thought we would start with taking a look at the state of global streaming. So these are just going to be some high-level global streaming trends, and then we're going to jump in because I picked a few of my favorite insights from the report to share. All right, so I think this is really important context to set the stage. But, you know, unsurprisingly, there's been a huge boom in the number of streaming series basically since the pandemic. And this really underpins all the streaming trends we're going to be looking at today. And just let me put some numbers to this. So if we look at from the beginning of 2020 to Q2 of 2022, the number of streaming original series more than doubled in that time period. And if we look at where we're at today, as of Q2, the total number of streaming original series is more than 3 times what it was prior to 2020. So that's some really enormous growth in the streaming space. And I think that's just really important context for everything we're going to be looking at. Now, so that was looking at the total number of series, but I think it's also important to consider the rate of growth because it tells a bit more nuanced story. So that's what the red line is. So that's the percent change in the number of streaming original series every quarter. And you can see at the beginning of 2020, things are moving along at about a 10% quarter-on-quarter growth. That was until Q3 2020, obviously when all the pandemic disruptions came into play. So we saw a cliff there, it really dropped off. But basically since then, it's continued to increase until the last quarter of 2022, when it was at an 11% quarter-on-quarter growth in the number of streaming originals. That was a new high point, but things have changed a bit this year. So this year, so far, we've had 2 consecutive quarters of slowing growth in terms of the number of new streaming series. That's the first time that's happened since the disruptions of the pandemic. And one thing that I think it's important to note with this is I don't think we've seen any of the impacts of the strikes hitting production yet. So if I were looking ahead, I would guess that there would probably be further slowdown as sort of the disruptions from the strike play out. So I think what we might be looking at here is potentially an end to peak streaming, definitely a slowdown. Now, all that was really important context for this chart. So we always look at the changing share of demand for different platforms' originals in the streaming space. That's what this chart is here. But it's important to remember that while different platforms' share of demand might change, the size of the total pie is growing. That's that massive growth we've seen in the number of streaming originals. But this is looking at the share of demand for each of these platforms' original series globally in the last quarter. Obviously, some high-level takeaways. Netflix is still the leader. Over a third of demand globally for streaming originals was for a Netflix series. Really unmatched when you look at the competition. But another thing I want to highlight is that over 50% of demand for streaming originals globally was for original series from the top 3 platforms. So that's Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, and Disney+. Obviously, Netflix has the huge size of their catalog. Amazon Prime Video has been in the game longer than a lot of these streamers, has done a really great job of making in-demand content in markets around the world, and Disney Plus has 2 of the biggest franchises that they can rely on. So some of the biggest hits are coming from Disney Plus. Another thing I'd want to highlight is just Apple TV Plus has really continued to grow in this measure. So they're currently at a 7.4% share of demand. That's just behind Disney, but they've really pulled ahead of the competition. And one last thing that's worth mentioning is, as of last quarter, nearly 25% of demand for streaming original series around the world was from series from platforms that aren't these platforms that are broken out here. So these tend to be local platforms or niche platforms that focus on a particular type of content, like Crunchyroll, for example, that does just anime, or Shudder that's focused on horror. So we've seen a lot of growth there outside of the major global platforms. But if that was just a snapshot in time where we were at this past quarter, I love this chart because it's a good reminder that we didn't just get there all of a sudden. This is a result of gradual quarter-on-quarter long-term trends. Obviously, looking at this chart, the big story is the gradual erosion of Netflix's advantage. So if we look at where we are at the beginning of 2020, almost half of demand globally for streaming original series was for a Netflix show. That's an amazing market share, but compare that to where we're at today, where about a third of demand is for a Netflix series. So increasing competition has really chipped away at their first mover advantage. And a few other things I wanted to highlight. I think it's worth calling out Amazon has done a really impressive job of holding onto their demand share, keeping a pretty consistent 11% demand share throughout all of this, despite all the increasing competition. And in contrast to Netflix, whose demand share has really just been chipped away at. What does this mean? I think this means that Amazon's growing demand for its streaming originals has kept pace with the total growth we've seen in streaming overall. And like I said, it's interesting contrast that with Netflix. So they've both been around some of the older platforms we're looking at here, but Amazon's held on to their around 11% demand share pretty consistently throughout time, despite all these changes. And then I want to highlight 2 of the winners of the last few quarters. So Apple TV Plus and Paramount Plus, they both hit a new record share of demand globally for their original series. This last quarter, Apple TV Plus was on a 7.4% share of demand, and Paramount Plus at 5%. This is a new record for them across time we've been looking at. And you can see that over the last few quarters, they've been experiencing some steady growth. Right, so that was a bit of an aggregate view, but I really like how this scatter plot shows how we get there through the success of individual streaming series. And you can really get a sense of the different approaches these platforms have. So obviously looking at Netflix, that's a bit of the throw all of your resources at it approach. If you make this many series, there are bound to be some that succeed. And we can contrast that with some of the other platforms that aren't putting out quite the same level of amount of content, but are still seeing good success, like Apple TV Plus. And I did want to highlight, if you look at all the streaming original series for the past quarter, Ted Lasso was actually the globally most in-demand streaming original in Q2. So that's another feather in Apple TV Plus's cap. But we can look at this in another way. So what we're looking at here is the share of platform originals that make it above 2 times the average series demand. And this I like to think of as a platform's hit rate. And this is maybe a bit of an efficiency metric. So you can think of this as how many shows does each platform have to release to get a hit? And if we look at Apple, for example, had the best hit rate for the quarter. 45.5% of Apple TV Plus originals had 2 times the average series demand or higher in the past quarter. And that's the best of all the platforms we looked at. So to put that another way, you could think of it as Apple has to release, for every 2 shows Apple releases, 1 is a hit. And we can compare that to Netflix, where it's more like for every 5 shows Netflix releases, 1 gets over 2 times the average series demand. So it's a bit of like how many shows do you have to release to get a hit? I do think it's important to note that it's a bit of a different strategy depending on where a platform's at in its maturity stage. So for Netflix, obviously they're the oldest game in town. To grow their subscriber base, the best thing for them to do might not be necessarily to just keep making what we would call hits. It might be with hyper-targeted content. Maybe that's a specific niche genre, or maybe it's content in a specific market where they can grow their subscriber base. And these might not necessarily be what we would think of as hits. So even though Netflix's hit rate is lower than Apple's, that might not necessarily be a bad thing. They might be doing what they need to do to grow their subscribers. Great. So that was a high-level overview of what's going on in the global streaming landscape, but I wanted to expand the scope now to consider all series. And even though we focus a lot on streaming originals, because that's where a lot of the growth is, that's where we get a lot of questions, I want to emphasize that this report looks at demand for all series, streaming and linear, which is one of the really cool things about demand data, that you can compare a Netflix original and a broadcast show side by side with one metric and put them on equal footing to see which is doing better. So to begin, if you've read the report in the past, you'll know that for every market, we look at the breakdown of demand by genre. And this is where you see a lot of the cool market-specific behavior. But here we're looking at how the share of global demand for genres has shifted over the last 5 or so years. I think this is just important context. So what have we seen? We've seen a big growth in global demand for animated series. So the first half of this year, 13% of demand for all shows globally was for an animated series. And that growth has really come at the expense of reality and comedy series. So they've seen some of the biggest decreases in percent terms. And then if we look at dramas still make up the largest share of demand globally for series. And they've seen a bit of a decrease, but in percentage terms, going from 41% in 2018 to 39% today is not much of a change compared to the decreases we've seen in reality and comedy. Right, and I always like to highlight the most successful new series premieres each quarter. And I like this chart in particular because it puts the shows on equal footing. We're looking at here the average demand for each of these new series 30 days following their series premiere. Obviously, there's a big winner looking at this chart this quarter. That Secret Invasion from Disney Plus had phenomenal demand in its first 30 days, 102.4 times the average series demand globally in its first 30 days. You can compare that to the number 2 show of the quarter, Citadel, that had 50x the average demand. So it's really in a league of its own. I think there's been an interesting story here. So Secret Invasion is the first Marvel series to come out on Disney Plus since She-Hulk premiered in August. So there's been quite a gap in Marvel series since Secret Invasion premiered, and it's had one of the best premieres in terms of its demand compared to other recent Marvel series. And I think what that means is that having that gap allowed demand for the franchise to build up over time and helped drive their successful premiere. If you remember when Disney Plus first came out and it was just back-to-back new Marvel series premiering, it was hard to keep up with. I think potentially they were cannibalizing some of their own attention. So I think this is good news for a platform that might be looking to stretch their resources a bit more. So spacing out series in a franchise a little bit more can help demand build up. And a couple patterns I wanted to point out in the most successful series premieres. So here, I'm just highlighting the 3 new series that premiered that were part of franchises. And what I always like to say about franchises, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So obviously Secret Invasion, Marvel franchise, but we also had a new series in the Walking Dead franchise, Dead City. And then the first new series in extending the Bridgerton universe, so Queen Charlotte. So these 3 series ranked in the top 10 for the quarter. Obviously, having that connection to an existing franchise helped them get a leg up and have a successful premiere. We see this a lot. And finally, I think it's worth noting again, Apple TV Plus's success. So 3 of the 10 most in-demand new series premieres for the past quarter were Apple TV Plus originals. And think back to that scatter plot chart we just looked at. So when considering Apple TV Plus compared to Netflix in terms of the amount of content, the sheer amount of content that Netflix puts out, it's really surprising that Apple TV Plus had 3 of the 10 most in-demand series premieres, and Netflix only had 1. So that's really a testament to their high hit rate. Great, so that's what I have for global trends, but now I wanted to get into some market-specific things. And these are the 10 markets we cover in the report. We always try to get some good geographic representation. But this quarter, we had a bit of a focus on Latin America. So 5 of the 10 markets we looked at were in the region. And you might expect that countries in the same region would have similar demand patterns, but actually there's a fair amount of difference in the preferences across these markets. Great, so one theme across the report was that local content is still key. We talk a lot about global hits, but actually in multiple markets, the content from local channels and platforms makes up the largest share of demand, and local series top the ranking of most in-demand shows. And we saw this across Latin America, so I just wanted to highlight a few of the success stories. Right, so here we're looking at Colombia. We have two Colombian channels, RCN TV and Carousel Television. They had the first and second largest share of demand for their original series. Almost 12% of demand in Colombia last quarter was for an RCN TV show, like Ana de Nadia. That's just an example I've highlighted here. And then almost 10% of demand was for a Carousel TV show, like this reality series here. And one other note about Colombia that was interesting, Colombia had the highest demand for soap operas in the report, and a lot of that demand was driven by local productions, like Ana de Nadia, for example. Great, and so here we're looking at Argentina and Chile. And in these 2 markets, the most in-demand show was a local version of a global franchise. So in Argentina, MasterChef Argentina was the #1 show for the quarter, had 22 times the average series demand. And in Chile, another local version of a globally popular reality franchise, Gran Hermano Chile, so that's obviously part of the Big Brother franchise, was the #1 show for the quarter. It had almost 30 times the average series demand. And it helped drive the demand share for its original channel, Mega, which is a local Chilean channel, to be higher than even Netflix for the quarter. And finally, we have Mexico and Brazil. So in Mexico, nearly 10% demand for shows was for a series from Las Estrellas. And this channel has a lot of popular shows, not just in Mexico, but across the region. Just highlighting one here, La Rosa de Guadalupe. This is a perennially popular show that we see pop up in a lot of different markets. And in Brazil, originals from Globo had the largest share of demand in Brazil, almost 12% share. And here we have another local version of a global franchise, Big Brother Brazil, doing well. Great, so I want to do a bit of a deep dive on Thailand now. So every quarter, there's at least one market that's totally unique. And in this report, that was Thailand. It was one of the most interesting ones to look at. So what made it unique? Nearly half of the demand for all shows in Thailand was for a drama series. That made it the most drama-loving market we looked at. But digging into that a bit more to understand what's behind that, we can see, looking at the top subgenres for the quarter, that romantic dramas were the most in-demand subgenre. And that was unique across the report. So usually when we see the most in-demand subgenre, tends to be crime drama or soap opera, for example. Thailand was unique in that romantic dramas did so well. And we also see that romantic comedies did well. So they ranked as the 10th most in-demand subgenre. So there's a bit of a theme of romance that crosses dramas and comedies, and romantic content in general seems to do well in Thailand. But this is being driven by content from local channels. So two channels, Thailand Channel 3 and GMM25, had the largest shares of demand in Thailand for the quarter. And specifically, it's high demand for these channels, romantic dramas, that's giving them an edge in the market. So both of them beat out Netflix for the quarter. Huge number of Thai dramas that are succeeding in their home market. But it's interesting, we also see international streamers moving in. So the number 2 most in-demand show for the quarter in Thailand was a Thai series from Amazon Prime Video. Had over 18 times the average series demand for the quarter. So I think this is a sign that international platforms are starting to recognize the opportunity here and breaking into the market with local content. Great. So those are all examples of local content succeeding in its home market around the world, but I still want to emphasize that international content is continuing to catch on outside of its home market. So here's just an example of the share of demand globally by original language. So we can see there's been a boom in global demand for non-English content in the last few years, pretty much starting in 2020, but it's continued through today. And so far this year, almost 40% of global demand for shows was for non-English series. So we really see growth in that area. But I wanted to highlight a few specific examples from the report of international content catching on outside of its home market. So to begin with, Turkey. Across markets in the report, it was really interesting to see different Turkish series succeeding. So these are just 4 examples I picked from different markets. What was interesting is they're all different shows. It's not like there was one Turkish show that was a success across countries this past quarter. It's different shows succeeding in different markets. And I think this is a nice sampling because it shows the variety of content. So if we look at on the left, Erkenci Kus in Portugal, it ranked as the 13th most in-demand show. That's a rom-com. But in Austria, Kurulus Osman, that's a historical drama. You might be able to tell from the picture. And the others are just different flavors of dramas succeeding in different markets around the world. So that was definitely a theme that popped out in the report. But I want to look at US demand for Turkish content. And putting it against supply, we can see that in the US, demand for Turkish series has really boomed in 2022, and it's outpaced the growth in number of series. So there's been growing demand for Turkish content, but supply hasn't yet caught up in the US. And I wanted to, as a point of comparison, show the trajectory that Korean content has taken, just to compare it. So if we look back at the end of 2021, when Squid Game came out, that represented a bit of a high watermark for Korean content. There was definitely a boom there. It also wasn't just Squid Game. I think there were a few other Korean series that were catching on at the time. But we see following that spike, the supply of Korean series, so the number of Korean shows picked up and really rose quickly, but demand did not keep up with that. So it flatlined for a bit, but it started to catch up a bit in 2023 so far. So when looking at Korean content, there was a spike in demand. Supply responded to that, but outpaced demand. And we haven't seen that with Turkish shows yet. So there's been a boom in demand, but supply hasn't kept up. And this is just a really fun chart, I thought. So here we're comparing the audience demographics for Korean content and Turkish content. And it's just a fun contrast because they're basically inverse of each other. So we see with Korean content, the vast majority of audiences for Korean content are Gen Z, almost 60%. And the audience for Korean content tends to skew female. Contrast that with Turkish content, almost 70% of the audience for Turkish series around the world is male, and it tends to do best with the over 40 age group. So yeah, 2 emerging content globally successful content from markets, but with entirely different audiences. All right. Next, I want to highlight how Americans are starting to discover more Australian content. And I want to motivate this first with a little anecdote. So I remember several years ago, there was an article about how popular Peppa Pig was, and that American kids were starting to speak with British accents because of it. So this year I saw a similar article about how Bluey is making American kids talk with Australian accents. And then I just had to dig into it a bit. So here we're looking at the most in-demand non-US kids series in the US. And if we look back at 2021, Bluey, that's the one that's highlighted, lagged the others. And in fact, if we're comparing it to Peppa Pig, I think 2021 is about the time I read the article about Peppa Pig, catching on with American children. And it had about twice the demand of Bluey at that point. But what's been really impressive is that Bluey has had consistent growth over the last several years, eventually surpassing Peppa Pig. And more recently, it's ranked in the top 3 non-US kids series with American audiences. So it's just behind Paw Patrol now. And it's even beat out Pokemon, which is obviously a long-running favorite. But it's not just Bluey, it's Australian content more generally. So here we're looking at the average demand in the US for new premieres from the UK and Australia. I thought the UK was an interesting point of comparison. So if we look at the past 3 years, the average demand for new British series in the US has pretty consistently outpaced new Australian series until this year. So this year, we've seen the average demand for new Australian series has really exceeded new British series. So it definitely seems like something is happening with Australian content catching on in the US this year. And these are just a few examples of the new Australian series that have caught on with US audiences so far this year. It's not just Bluey. And I wanted to highlight a few of them. So first, the one that's had the most success so far is Deadlock, and that's an Amazon Prime series. We can see the purple lines have the highest peak in its demand. And another show from Disney Plus, The Clearing, that's a Disney Plus original, but it's available on Hulu in the US. It premiered around the same time, also had a big spike in demand. And then more recently, another Amazon Prime Australian series, The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart, has had really good success. We can see that's the blue line. And then finally, the yellow line, Bay of Fires. So that's actually really similar to Deadlock. It's a black comedy crime drama set in Tasmania, but this is from ABC Australia. That's caught on gradually over the last couple of months. And then finally, similar to what we looked at with Korean and Turkish content, I just wanted to compare the audiences for British and Australian content, and we can actually see that they're very similar. So they both have a pretty even split between men and women, and both generally tend to do best with the over 40 age group. So what does this mean? This means if you're looking to add some Australian content into the mix, you can expect that it will appeal to about the same audience as British content. All right. So bringing it all together, what does this mean for how streamers are fighting for audience attention in the US? Here we're looking at different platforms in the US, their total catalog, and then the share of titles on their platform compared to the share of demand for non-US series. So which platforms have the most international catalogs, and how does demand for this content stack up? So right away, we can see that Netflix and Amazon Prime Video are the leaders in this space. Over 60% of the shows available on their platform in the US are from non-US markets. That's well ahead of any of the competition in the US. But obviously, these are global platforms, and they've been making global content around the world and bringing that to US audiences. So that partially explains it. But I wanted to think of this through the lens of the current strike. So if the strike continues to stop domestic production, international content is one thing that platforms could leverage to bring new content to US audiences if the domestic content pipeline has stopped. So with that in mind, it looks like Netflix and Amazon Prime Video are the best positioned to leverage their existing international catalogs. And just think of the Amazon Prime Video international series that we've highlighted have had success so far. So the Thai drama we looked at, and then 2 Australian series. So Prime Video is really putting out a lot of in-demand international content that they can then bring to US audiences. And then one thing I want to call out looking at this chart is you can see the share of demand on each of these platforms for international content is lower than the share of supply. So that means that domestic content still tends to perform better. Huge international hits like Squid Game or La Casa de Papel, they tend to be the exception rather than the rule, even though American audiences are becoming more open to consuming international content. And then finally, I wanted to look at how these platforms are approaching international programming. So there's actually quite a lot of difference in terms of where demand for these platforms, international libraries, is coming from. So we start on the left, look at Max. It had the largest share of demand for its non-US English language catalog. So this is international content coming from other English-speaking markets like the UK, Australia, even Canada. So almost 80% of demand for international shows on Max was for an English-speaking international series. If we look at Hulu on the far right, we can see that almost 3/4 of demand for international content on Hulu was for a series from Asia. That might sound a bit surprising at first, but what's going on here is that Hulu's trying to make itself a destination for animation. They built out a dedicated animation hub called Animayhem. And this includes animated comedies like The Simpsons, for example, but also a lot of Japanese anime. And so that's what's driving this large share of demand for Asian content on Hulu. And then if we look at Netflix, Netflix is probably the most balanced in terms of where it's getting its international, where demand for its international content is coming from. So it actually had the largest share of demand for its international series that are from Europe, but it's pretty evenly balanced across the different regions. So Europe, Asia, other English-speaking markets. And one thing I note is that maybe if these streamers pick up on some of the trends I've highlighted, you'll start to see some more Turkish or Australian content coming out on these platforms. So watch out for that. And that's the end of what I had prepared today. But just a reminder, if you want to get the full report for a deep dive into all 10 markets we covered, you can get it on our Demand 360 platform. And this is just highlighting some of the other amazing features you get on Demand 360 Lite. So obviously, you'll get access to the Global TV Demand Report. And that's in addition to all of our other insights articles that are on current trends and topics. But you also get access to global demand data on over 25,000 shows, over 15,000 movies, over 20,000 talent in more than 50 markets around the world. I always have to keep updating these numbers because it's always growing. So yeah, so sign up to Demand 360 Lite. We have a 30% discount for webinar attendees today. You can get the report there. Let me just pause and check if any questions have come in that I can answer. We've got a bit of time to address those.
Thank you, Chris. Very insightful, informative, as always. It's great to see Australian content having a bit of a moment. I'm not sure, though, if I'd want all US kids to start turning into mini Aussies now. But it's really super interesting. Just answering that question live, the demand multiplier just represents how much more in demand a show is relative to the local market's average. And we also had another question here. We can probably take that one live. The Hulu metric does not include Hulu Japan, does it?
Correct. Does not include Hulu Japan. We'll treat that as its own thing.
Yeah. All right. That's about it. There weren't actually too many other questions that came in from the live session, Chris. There were a couple, but I've answered those. Were there any that you wanted to dive into from the pre-submitted questions?
So actually, a lot of the questions that came in were really on point. It was already things we were going to be talking about. I think we had a question come in about demand trends in Latin America. So we obviously talked about that. We had someone from Australia ask about Australian content trends, so touched on that.
Yep.
We had a couple of questions come in about the strikes. So I've looked at that through the lens of international content. But that's obviously a developing situation. I did have 2 other charts prepared ahead of time. So if I can feel free to share those.
Absolutely. I mean, if people want to jump off, they can. So why don't you jump to those? It's like, it's like the little thing that you get at the end of a movie, do you sit through the credits or not? Is it worth it? Well, you're about to find out. Chris, what else you got?
No, it's like if you're a band playing a show, and even if no one's asking for an encore, you still give them an encore. So that's what this is.
But they have
Here
choice.
we
People have
are.
a choice. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just a few things that I want to highlight, looking a bit more into US streaming, because we had some questions coming in about that. This is looking at how these platforms stacked up in terms of their total catalog demand for shows and movies in the past quarter. Because we focus a bit on platform originals, but this is total catalog, so it's really everything available on these platforms, shows and movies, the whole package. And in the US, we can really see there's a clear three-way race between Netflix, Max, and Hulu. They're pretty close in terms of the total demand for all content that they have, but they have different strengths. So Hulu's obviously has its strength in shows, has the largest share of demand for shows on its platform, has a huge catalog of shows in the US. If we look at Max's strength is really with its movies. It has the largest share of demand for movies on platform in the US, and Netflix is a bit more balanced. So definitely a three-way race at the top, but other platforms are catching up and competing in the race. So there's a tight race between Prime Video and Paramount Plus in terms of their content. And then someone asked about pricing, and we have this analysis that we do, and I really like this because, okay, let me explain what we're looking at. We're looking at total demand for all shows and movies on these platforms, and we're putting against the monthly price they charge as a subscription. Specifically, we're looking at ad-free tiers just to make everything equal. But I always like this chart because it makes it so clear the like almost linear relationship that there is between the demand for shows and movies on a platform and the price they can charge, which makes perfect sense because what are platforms offering their subscribers? They're offering them in-demand content. And if they have more of that, they can charge more. So this chart gives a bit of a sense of who has a little flexibility when it comes to raising prices. I think it's also interesting if you look at the very top, that's the Disney Plus, Hulu, ESPN Plus bundle. So that's the most expensive of all these options, but it also has the most content. So that's really interesting to see that even this huge expensive bundle is priced in line with what we'd expect given the amount of content it's offering its subscribers. Some other things to consider when we're looking at like which platforms may have some room to increase prices. It looks like currently, I mean, this is just a snapshot in July, but Max is a little overpriced compared to what it's offering subscribers. So maybe they don't quite have as much flexibility when it comes to raising prices looking ahead. But yeah, in general, most platforms seem to follow this line pretty well. Yeah, those are the two extra charts I had prepared. So have any other questions come in?
There are some coming in, some live ones coming in. So I just wanted to say this chart here that was just presented, that was obviously worth sticking around for. So you kept the best
Yeah,
for
save
last.
best to last. Save best to last.
Just one here, what do you make of demand for catalog series premiering on new platforms? Suits on Netflix, Yellowstone on CBS, linear. I mean, the quick answer is we're platform agnostic and content specific, right? It relates to our demand measurement methodology. Anything else you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I mean, we've been tracking, when shows like Suits premiere Netflix and then become a hit, even years after they've ended, like we can see that in the demand. So it's, even though we're platform agnostic, we can see when the availability on a new platform increases demand and awareness for a show. So we see that happening in our data also. Yeah.
Absolutely, and we got some more questions coming in. I'll leave it to you if you want to tackle any of those.
Oh, there's coming directly in the chat. Yeah,
yeah, they're just direct in the chat. All the questions have been saved to the end, Chris. You see,
well, people need time to mull it over. Okay, so someone's asking if this relationship holds in Latin and Asia. So actually, that's a great question. I haven't looked into that. We tend to be a little more focused on the U.S. streaming landscape, but it's definitely worth investigating. I mean, this is definitely an analysis we could replicate for these different regions. If I had to guess, I would hope it holds, because if it doesn't hold, what does that mean? That means that platforms are charging their consumers prices that are out of line with what they're offering them. So
And then also the kind of just the value of money and the currency differences and all that feeds in.
Yeah, there's a lot to factor in, really, but definitely worth looking at. Maybe we'll do that in the future. Is there a global view on how competitively priced the platforms are? Oh, that's a good question. That's very hard to do, because when you think about a global view, each of these platforms' catalogs is different in every market. So it starts to get hard when you're considering a global perspective. And I tend not to do on-platform analysis at a global level, because it's also not so actionable, right? You know, these platforms are making programming decisions at market level. So, and you know, like you'll see in the report, different countries' audiences have totally different demand preferences. So it's harder and less applicable to think of this at a global level.
Just a quick one.
Market by market.
Yeah, makes sense. Just a quick one on the second bullet point on this slide, bundle there. Are we saying content bundle? Are we considering the entire ecosystem of a platform, or the flywheel, the business model?
Yeah, so bundling, that would be like the Disney Plus Hulu ESPN bundle. So that's platforms that are offering a bundled price for like combinations of themselves. We used to have also Paramount Plus and Showtime as like a separate bundle, but recently Showtime as a standalone thing has been discontinued and just like automatically rolled into Paramount Plus. We see a similar thing happening with Max and Discovery Plus. They've just like brought that content over. So some platforms aren't bundling exactly, but they're, you know, merging. But yeah, in terms of bundling, the Disney Plus Hulu example is the best one. So that's you know, a special price that they set for a combination of two or more platforms. Let's see some of these other questions coming in.
Just a reminder, Chris, if they're directly submitted to us, others in the chat won't have seen the question, so maybe just repeat the question.
Yeah, great point.
I've just replied to Christine on the methodology.
So this is a good question, actually. So Mike asked, for the two companies with the most international offerings and greatest global reach, Netflix and Prime, so like that's like what we saw, are you seeing similarities in geographic demand increases, or are different territories growing quickest for each service? So there's definitely differences between these two platforms. So I always like to highlight the example of Amazon Prime in India. They've had some amazing success in that market. What's cool with that? So we've done a deep dive on India before, and several Amazon Prime originals tend to do well within that market. Sorry, they're Amazon Prime Indian originals, so they're local to the market. They tend to do well in that market, but they also tend to do well outside of that market. So that's one thing we've seen with Amazon and also Netflix is they can make content for a specific market, does well there, but then they also are in a position to bring that content to global audiences and make it more of a global hit. But yeah, there are obviously different strengths in these platforms. So I think Netflix has a bit of a stronger position in terms of Korean content. They've had a lot of K-dramas catch on around the world. Amazon with India, and then we highlight a few other examples of Amazon breaking into local markets. So Thailand, Australia.
That's Chris's reading face.
Yeah, sorry. I'm looking through the questions right now. Just seeing what's coming. Yeah, we had a few questions coming on our methodology. So I just encourage everyone who has any questions on, you know, what are demands based on, how we collect it, to just check out those links. That's like a full deep explanation that we don't have time to go into as much right now, but just read up on it. It's all there.
There's even a 2-minute video to watch. If you don't want
Okay, someone asked a good question. So out of the massive libraries, what percentage are trending day over day? Is there a 95-5% ratio versus the old 80-20 rule of thumb for total user consumption? So actually, we've done a bit of analysis on how top heavy different platforms are, and this is really interesting. So I think I just pulled this data in August in the US. If we consider all shows on platform on Netflix, about 7% of titles make up about 50% of demand. So that's relatively top heavy. But as a point of comparison, Apple TV Plus is definitely more even. The demand is more evenly spread across the top titles. So the top 14 or so percent of shows make up 50% of demand on Apple TV Plus. And then I think those are kind of the two extremes, and then other platforms are kind of fall somewhere in the middle. So definitely different levels of top heaviness. So that ratio is different depending on the platform.
Rural versus metro. That's an interesting one.
Super interesting. I don't.
Could look at it from an IP on an IP basis, but we've not done a lot of studies there. So we
Yeah.
cover the globe. So
I'm realizing like this Q&A session is almost like a great way to just gather ideas for things we can look into.
absolutely.
I'm reading these questions and thinking like, oh, we haven't done that,
Yeah.
but like that would be very interesting to look at.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I've answered everything that we can address today, but some great questions came in. Like, really appreciate the engagement, everyone. Thank you.
Absolutely. And look, if you've got any further questions for us relating to today's presentation, then by all means send those through to us. Best way to do that is actually to just hit reply when you get the email from us in the next 24 hours or so with the webinar recording and this presentation that was shared today. Thank you again for being here with us today, wherever you are. And we will see you once more at the next Parrot Analytics Live. Have a great rest to the end of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Have a nice
Thank
day.
you.